Okay, so the fact that we have speciation, we have species, we have the different concepts of species. So how did all of this come about? In order to understand that, we actually have to understand what speciation is about, the whole process. So what I'll do is I'll play a video for you guys, all right? And just watch that video, and then we'll come back to our discussion.
There are almost 10,000 known bird species on the planet. How did they evolve into so many unique forms? Take the birds of paradise, for example, with their dizzying array of colors, shapes, and sizes. From genetic evidence, we know that the ancestor of all 39 species was a plain, crow-like bird. And the process that caused this one species to split into many is called speciation. Before we explain speciation, let's talk about what we mean when we use the word species. According to the classic definition, species are groups of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations which are reproductively isolated from other groups. Speciation begins when groups become separated in space or become different enough in form and behavior that individuals from one group no longer regularly mate with individuals outside the group. One way for a new species to evolve starts when a few individuals colonize a new area that is outside their native range. Take, for example, a volcanic island that rises out of the sea just off the coast of the mainland. Over millions of years, as the island grows larger and less volcanically active, plants begin to grow, but there are no birds here yet. One day, birds from a common species on the mainland are blown over by a storm and start a new population. If these birds move between the island and the mainland only rarely, the conditions for reproductive isolation are set, and the brand new island population is on its way to becoming a new species. Over thousands of generations, the two populations will be shaped by natural and sexual selection into separate forms, each with a unique genetic fingerprint. But at what point are we confident that this island population has really changed enough to become a new species? Well, let's put our definition to the test. If we introduce a female from the mainland species to a potential mate from the island after 200 generations in isolation, about 400 years in bird terms, will they mate? It appears that these two still recognize each other as members of the same species. How about after another 1,000 generations of isolation? Now, the female finds this island male song a bit strange, but she still chooses to mate with him. What if we fast forward again to 10,000 generations of isolation? This time, the female doesn't even recognize the male song and is completely uninterested. If this female's mating preferences are widespread in the population, we now have two bona fide species, mainland and island. These kinds of dating matchups don't happen in reality. Here, because our birds avoid flights across the open ocean, island birds do not regularly encounter mainland birds. Because genes from the two populations no longer intermix, genetic differences accumulate, and the two populations become different species. So in practice, scientists classify species separated in space by their genetic differences, not by observing blind dates. But there is another kind of speciation that can occur when a habitat becomes divided and a population becomes fragmented. Imagine that our new island grows larger over time, and the volcano develops a central mountain ridge, while a valley forms along the eastern coast. Over time, the eastern birds, who have plentiful fruit resources and only need a single parent to successfully raise young, evolve specialized mating systems. Males compete for multiple mates, and to get noticed, evolve fancy plumage and display behaviors. On one side of the valley, the males evolve elaborate head plumes, and on the other, it's the tails that get fancy. At the same time, Western birds are consistently dealing with harsher food conditions and do not evolve a specialized mating system or fancy feathers. Just as before, early in the speciation process, when individuals from isolated populations meet, our eastern and western birds readily mate. But as generations pass and the eastern males become fancier, the western females begin to find the eastern males' habits foreign and surprising. But these traits are clearly not deal breakers. Even after 10,000 generations of geographic isolation, some of the western females continue to find the males' displays attractive. At this stage, the eggs she lays aren't viable because the separated populations have evolved too many genetic differences to be compatible. To review, this kind of speciation, geographic barriers have split the habitat into 3 fragments, and on each, a unique species evolved. What if the southwestern slope erodes into a low peninsula, allowing southeastern birds to mix with the western birds? By this time, their mating systems are completely different, and the 2 species can't create fertile offspring. Now, related species can coexist, but because they no longer successfully interbreed, there's no going back. So how did the 39 bird of paradise species evolve from one crow-like ancestor? New Guinea and the surrounding islands where birds of paradise evolved have changed dramatically throughout geologic time, repeatedly isolating populations. Over thousands of generations in isolation, natural and sexual selection have morphed the fragmented populations into a wonderful array of colorful species. The process of speciation is ongoing, and split after split, new and unique organisms evolve. Incredibly, all those 10,000 bird species we see today evolved from one single bird ancestor. And it's thanks to the evolutionary processes driving speciation that our planet is home to such impressive biodiversity.
All right. It is, isn't it? I think it's why I like this video was that you actually sort of get the idea of that whole gray area of the speciation. Remember, we were talking about whether it's a definitive species or it's the same species, different species, or whichever. So again, of course, I've given a link so you can always check it out yourself. So one of the examples that the talker was explaining about was more of a geographical barrier. Okay, but with speciation is actually a lot more different kinds of forms rather than just geographical. Okay, but again, first let's go to the definition. Speciation is how a new kind of organism is created. Species of organism is created. Speciation occurs when a group within a species separates from other members of its species and develops its own unique characteristics, just like the one you saw in the video. Okay, then the types of isolation that comes about, okay, is prezygotic mechanism, which prevents, okay, so you have to learn the keyword, of course, this is referring to the zygote. So prezygote will be preventing any interspecies mating and fertilization. But postzygote is when a zygote actually forms. What happens to that? It's the prevention of maturation. So the zygote is formed, but this post-zygotic mechanism prevents maturation and reproduction in offspring from interspecies reproduction. Okay, so in order for speciation to happen, there must be something that prevents it from interbreeding. If two groups are reproductively isolated from one another, they can accumulate more differences in their alleles and genes through repeated cycles of mutation and natural selection. And populations tend to become more different over time, especially as they specialize in their different particular habitats. Okay, so with the mechanism that of prezygotic mechanism and postzygotic, we have ecological, behavioral, temporal, mechanical, and gametic. And for postzygotic is zygotic mortality, meaning it's dead, hybrid inviability, and hybrid infertility, meaning say they're able to grow, but then later on they're just unable. They actually to grow to adulthood, but they're not fertile. Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong. For Form 6, you guys have learned about prezygotic and postzygotic. Or even for matrix, I just want to have an idea. Just the definition. So not much examples, is it? Okay. So let's go through some examples here, okay? I have a mixture of marine, aquatic, and also some terrestrials. So just keep in mind. So the first one we're talking about, okay, ecological or geographical, which is it can be a literal barrier for reproduction. Now within ecological or geographical, there are 4 more different types, okay, which is Allopatry, Peripatry, Parapatric, and also Symphyritic. Now what basically happens is this is the original population, and now the outcome is that it forms into separate populations. But the process of how this happens is different. So one with Allopatric is you actually have a very definitive barrier that separates 2 equal populations. And then one becomes isolated from the original. The Peripatric is somewhat similar to Allopatric, but it's not like a 50-50 barrier, okay? So it's a small group that actually is isolated. More often not, this is like from an island to a mainland, okay? And then you have a Peripatric, which starts to sort of form a different group. And with genetic polymorphism, with Symphyritic, it actually forms a group within the bigger group. Okay. So obviously you're not going to get any idea, but first understand the concept. I think this chart is actually very helpful so that when I'm coming to the examples, you have these ideas in mind. Okay. So with Allopatric Speciation, it occurs when a species separates into 2 separate groups, which are isolated from one another. A physical barrier. So the physical barrier with Allopatric Speciation usually comes as like a mountain range or a waterway, which makes it impossible for them to interbreed with one another. Each species develops differently based on the demands of the unique habitat. So because of this different speciation, the barrier, it forms different habitats, okay? More often not, it forms different habitats. Or the genetic characteristics of the group are passed on to the offsprings. The isolated population then undergo genotypic and phenotypic divergence. So just keep in mind like the video of the bird. So they become subjected to dissimilar selective purposes with terms with their environment. They undergo a genetic drift and different mutations arise in the 2 populations. Okay, so let's go for some examples. In several freshwater lakes, a group of sticklebacks were physically cut off from the ocean population. Okay, this prevented the groups from interbreeding and the freshwater population gradually changed over time. So initially, there were the ocean population, okay, and some of the stickleback groups from the ocean population managed to get hold into the freshwater lakes. However, at some point, there was a physical cutoff. So from the physical cutoff, when of course they started breeding over time, obviously the freshwater ones started to adapt better with the freshwater lake environment. So obviously the pressures of the environment for freshwater changed the genetic and morphological aspect of the freshwater sticklebacks. Then at some extent, both the ocean ones and the freshwater ones cannot interbreed. Okay. Then you have an example of crickets from Hawaii. Okay. So in the Hawaiian Islands, DNA analysis shows that the branching pattern of speciation in flightless crickets matches the order of which the islands form. All right. So what this one is trying to show basically is, again, if for DNA analysis, towards the end here, usually it's it's what do you call this? The most distantly related species. And then you have those that are sort of more related here. So at one point, it all started from this island, and then it adapted and evolved towards more of the yellow one. And then after the yellow one, the pink one started to evolve, and then followed by the blue. And then the red ones are the most modern ones, okay? Not that the green ones is not modern, but they are probably a little bit, they are, what do you call this? These are the more latest descendants, okay, in comparison to the ones from Kauai. All right, the ones from the mainland Hawaii actually evolved from Kauai. Okay, and then this is another interesting one from the Galapagos Islands. We actually find different types of finch birds. Interestingly enough, because although they're all finch birds, okay, but the fact that their feeding behaviors are different, their beaks evolve to be different, and hence they become different species. So you have those that have the broader beak in order to be able to break seeds better. You have those that have more streamlined beaks in order to actually probe for insects. So, and that's good enough to be, although it's just a beak thing, but it's enough to actually define it into different species. Okay, so that's one type of species, speciation. So then we have the Peripatric Speciation. So how I mentioned like before, a subform of Allopatric Speciation. Remember in the picture you had like a 50-50 sort of split. So with this one though, a new species are formed in isolated smaller peripheral populations that are prevented from exchanging genes with the main population. It is related to the concept of a founder effect. So the founder effect is the loss of genetic variation that occurs when a new population is established by a very small number of individuals from a larger population. Okay. Genetic drift is often proposed to play a significant role in peripatric speciation, where the variation in the relative frequency of different genotypes in a small population, owing to the chance of disappearance of particular genes as individuals die or do not produce. Okay, basically to not confuse you guys with this, for allopatric speciation, again, it's a split. There's also a physical barrier. But the only differences with allopatric and peripatric is that allopatric, more often it's a 50-50 split in population. When it comes to allopatric, it's a small population that has diverged from a bigger mainland population. So a very good example here is this robins initially from the mainland here of Australia. And then once they've gone into the smaller islands here, they have formed their own species. So the robins were considered conspecific. When we use the term conspecific or conspecifity, it means they are of the same species. So the robins were once considered of the same species with the scarlet robin. Okay, so from this species, the scarlet robin here, okay, of Australia. But it was separated in 1999 with the Norfolk Island. So where do you have Norfolk Island? Okay, Norfolk Island is far west from Australia. So the Norfolk Island formed as part of the Pacific robin assemblage. Okay, it was determined to be a distinct species in 2015. Can you imagine this? From 1999 to 2015, it's not that big a range of time, but it's enough to actually already split and form its new species. From the mainland scarlet robin here, and then it later formed its own evolved form here. So again, remember how I mentioned, you might be thinking, but the other one also has islands. But look here, in terms of the land size is about different. But look at the land size here. This is the mainland here. So you're talking about mainland Australia, and then these are smaller islands. So it's very much different, yeah? So this is what, more often not, as I said, for allopatric, it's having to do with islands or compared to the mainland island or mainland area. How are we doing so far? Are we okay before we get into more details? Am I clear? Okay, good. So now we have Parapatric Speciation. In Parapatric Speciation, there is no specific intrinsic barrier to gene flow. The movement of genes between population, this may happen through migration of organisms or the movement of gametes. Okay. So the population is continuous, but nonetheless, the population does not mate randomly. Individuals that are more likely to mate with their geographic neighbors than with individuals in a different part of a population range. In this mode, divergence may happen because of a reduced gene flow within the population and varying selection pressures across the population range. I think a very good example with this is, okay, remember how I mentioned about this picture? To keep this in mind. So it's not a split of a barrier formation, okay? This is a new niche still within the geographical area, but it's just sort of a little bit out, not within. Okay, so going back to this, so example, when you're talking about any particular pressure in the environment, so some of these grass, example in this case scenario, some of these grass species of Anthoxanthum odoratum, they live near mines where the soil has become contaminated. So just that small change in contamination, it's enabled to make certain populations die or they mutate and grow to adapt. So these plants around the mines have experienced natural selection for genotypes that are tolerant over heavy metals. Again, so in a way, it's a form of natural selection because if they're able to form that form of genotype that is able to withstand the threshold of the contaminated soil, so then their later offsprings will bring on the gene flow that will enable it to tolerate heavy metals. Okay, so perhaps like for this uncontaminated soil, okay, so these species sort of grew as such. But then later on, the genotypes they found this particular flower or whatever, it's again some form of mutation, maybe a good mutation, or somewhat so much so that it's able to form a new species. Okay, but what is interesting, just so you know, that doesn't mean every mutation is bad. Okay, technically, if you really want to look at it, we as humans, we have mutated so much over time compared to our forefathers. If you want to go to Homo habilis, Homo erectus, etc. So, in some ways, mutation, it's somewhat a good point, okay? Because it's somewhat of you actually adapting to new environments. So anyhow, going back to this case study, so meanwhile, neighboring plants that don't live in polluted soil have not undergone selection for this trait. So the two types of plants are close enough that tolerant and non-tolerant individuals could potentially fertilize each other. So they seem to meet the first requirement of Peripatric Speciation, that of a continuous population. However, the two types have evolved different flowering times. This is interesting. So again, what they wanted to mention here is that there could be a possibility is because there's no exact physical barrier, it is likely that the species are not that different, that they could actually populate together. But now the thing is, they've evolved so much that they're different flowering times. So this change could be the first step in cutting off the gene flow entirely by the two groups. So there you go. All right. It's a slow, steady process, but it happens over time. So another one is Symphyritic Speciation, where the formation of two or more descendant species from a single ancestral species, all occupying the same geographical location. So what type of examples am I talking about here? So one of the more common ones is the cichlids. If cichlids are examples like flower horns, a lot of the Chinese actually like to use flower horns as to bring ong to their house. So that's a kind of cichlid. So cichlids of East Africa inhabiting reef valley lakes, particularly Lake Victoria, Lake Malawi, and Lake Tanganyika. There are over 800 described species, and according to estimates, there could be well over 1,600 species in the region. Their evolution is cited as an example of both natural and sexual selection. Another kind of study is a 2008 study suggests that Symphyritic Speciation has occurred in Tennessee cave salamanders, so all within the same cave. Symphyritic Speciation driven by ecological factors that may account from the extraordinary diversity of crustaceans living in the depths of Siberia Lake Baikal. Okay, so I think the better idea to understand is, again, a geographical location is not too big that many things can occur in that one small area. And more often not, the speciation comes from smaller species of organisms, okay, not bigger ones. So notice that the examples given here are lakes, caves, all right? So anything that is fairly small that can form different species, that has the potential of forming different species. So example here is that what causes the differences, what causes that geographical difference within the area, okay? Sometimes it can be just with sunlight, okay? So example, here you have male cichlids and you have female cichlids. So here cichlids experience sexual selection as females prefer males with similar coloration. This reproductive isolation sets cichlid species apart, which results in differentiable hybrids between species that share coloration attributes. Okay. However, regions at deep sea levels without enough light construct a barrier for coloration as sexual selection, which produce hybrids from different colorations. So again, in case of the lake, the fact that light actually plays a part in the different colorations. In fact, I think the fact that you've seen within ocean also, the fact that coral reef fishes are way more colorful in comparison to deep sea creatures. So the light penetration actually has an effect. But just imagine in such a small scale within a lake itself, the light penetration plays a part in terms of its coloration and therefore attracts different mates who want to mate based on different colors. Okay, so that's where symphyritic speciation refers to the divergence of species by isolation within the same geographical location without a physical barrier. So you notice that there's no physical barrier, it's only light penetration. So it's very subtle, it's not quite seen. Okay, then of course based on the examples they've given here lah. All right, so these are the 4 different parts for ecological isolation. Are we okay before we move to the next one? Any particular questions? Okay, good. If some of you are feeling confused, everything clear, very good. Good to know that my explanation is clear. If you feel there's any questions you want to clarify, you can always message me personally also, okay? But I'm glad to know everybody's doing fine. All right. So again, this is a summary of the geographical isolations. You have the allopatric, again it's a 50-50 thing. Peripatric is a small isolation. Peripatric continuous distribution, like the contaminated soil thing. And again, within the range of ancestral population. So it's within a small area, but there's very minimal barriers. Like again, light has to do with it or something like that. All right. So now moving into behavior, which is, of course, behavior is the barrier to reproduction. So the behavior that they're talking about here is, it can be the way a mating call is done. So like the bird's mating call, even if the dance is such that, that's how certain species relate to each other. So that is what behavior is defined as. So in the case of these fireflies, so different types of fireflies have distinct blinking patterns. So during summer, it's not unusual to find multiple species of fireflies at the same fields mating at the same time. However, because each species has its own blinking pattern, mates can easily find one another and avoid fruitless relationships. So there you go. Just because of a difference in the blinking pattern, they're able to form its own species. And then you have timing, where if groups meet at different times, they're probably not going to interbreed. Okay? So perfect example, which all of you can relate to, are corals. Okay? So to reproduce, coral releases packets of eggs and sperms into the water. The gametes flow to the surface and merge to make offsprings. So in coral reefs, very closely related to species that live together, and their gametes are capable of fertilizing one another. Coral time, their gametes release according to different seasons. Okay, of course, different light, mooting, and then some might actually miss by mere hours. So that differences alone in relation to waves, in relation to currents, most particularly in relation to the different phases of the moon. And I think recently Dr. James and team actually have actually found, I think, Acropora species that are actually releasing gametes now into the water. So probably now that's a season for Acropora. I don't know if it applies for all corals at the same time. So again, if you guys are interested, perhaps best to ask his team about it in more detail. All right, then we have anatomy. So the reproduction requires the right kinds of anatomy in most ways that you may think. So example here, again, I'm sorry, this is not marine or freshwater. I'll try to find more different ones, but I think just to give you an idea of just how the reproductive anatomy is so different, so much so that this species differentiate. So they have these tropical beetles that live in overlapping areas, but the pairs look pretty much identical. So much so you might think that it's just a variation. But so much so their reproductive organs are so different. So you can see how the yellow, the red, and blue, when they overlap each other, you can see that how it looks pretty much almost similar, but the reproductive organs are already so different here. So much so that it's impossible to actually mate with each other. Okay, then you have a difference also in terms of how the openings of the genital openings of the snail. The alignments so much so are different that also can affect the way they reproduce. So obviously this one has to be in a way opposites of each other in order to align well. But if they have the same alignment, it's going to be very difficult to actually to actually exchange their gametes. So that also is another form of anatomical similarities. Then you have genetic incompatibility. So very different from this one in such that gametes can actually play a part, of course, but this one, the key word here is more of the time. So which is why they brought in the term of seasons of the light and moon, or the timing. And in this case, example, we have sea urchins that have proteins on the surface of their gametes that allows eggs and sperm to recognize one another and merge. In some closely related species, variations of this protein make it impossible for gametes to connect. So this is more of a genetic isolation or gametic isolation. Okay, are we good with this so far? Before we move into postzygotic, we've covered all the prezygotic ones. Good. So now again, prezygotic basically is that there is no way, thank you very much all, there is no way for them to actually form a zygote. But now in the case that a zygote does get formed, so what are the different processes that are involved here? So the first phase, the first form of it is zygotic mortality. So in this case, mating and fertilizations are possible, but the genetic differences result in a zygote that is unable to develop properly, and thus the zygote becomes dead. Okay, so in a case a sheep and a zygote, they might mate, but then there's no zygote formation, or in the case the zygote forms but it dies. Okay, actually that's a better way to term it. The zygote forms, but it does die. Okay, if it doesn't form at all, then it covers all the pre-zygotic forms. But postzygotic is the zygote forms, but it either dies or it's not fertile and whatnot. So this is the first phase lah, or first form, I would say. Now the second part is the hybrid inviability. So in this case, the zygote doesn't die. It actually forms, it develops, and it comes out. However, once it is born, then it dies. So it dies before birth, or it's born alive but cannot survive to maturity. So it dies at a fairly young age. So you have tigers and leopards. So the zygote develops, but then pregnancy ends in a miscarriage or stillborn. So you notice how it's more of a process here. So in this case, the zygote dies within the womb. In this case, it's dead after birth, or a miscarriage is formed or stillborn, or it might be alive but it doesn't come to maturity. So this is hybrid inviability. Then we have the case of hybrids which do survive. Okay, so the hybrid individual develops and remains healthy and viable, but they are sterile. So sterile meaning they are unable to form their own offsprings. So again, like the donkey and a horse is a mule, tiger, lion, tigon, and you have a few others out there. Okay, now this one is quite interesting. Some organisms commonly reproduce with similar species in the wild and form genetic hybrids. In 2006, the first wild polar bear grizzly bear hybrid was found in Canada. It's either called a pizzly or a grola, depending on which is the first parent. If the father is a polar, the mother is grizzly, then pizzly. Then this one is the other one. These hybrids can produce fertile offspring. Okay, so correction here. In this case, this is infertile. But in this case, you form a fertile offspring. So by saying that it's a fertile offspring, hey, it shouldn't even be hybrid. It should actually be considered similar species, isn't it? So, but however, polar bears and grizzly bears are still classified as different species due to their habitat needs. And there's a few others. If you want to know more about why, again, this is in relation to how long the evolutionary line is, so much so that they can still, okay, I would really recommend you to watch up this video. But you notice how this one is two of the most closely related descendants in comparison to all of the others. So yes, the timeline, you might see, like in the case of donkeys and horses, it's way longer in comparison to the evolutionary line of differentiating species of polar bear and brown bear. Okay, by right you might think, the fact that it's a fertile hybrid, by right they should be similar, but scientists actually managed to differentiate this as a different species. So if you want to check it out why, in terms of the timeline, go and check out this website. And technically, that's the end of my class today. Are there any questions? No questions. Awesome. So if there's no questions, then I look forward to my class with you guys next week. So thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, have a wonderful day ahead.